Hello and welcome to Ghoul School. I'm Lauren and I will be your Ghoul Guide for today. And in this episode, I will be attempting to explain, break down and make simple the Sublime. Now, the Sublime is one of those terms that crops up a lot when we're talking about the Gothic. And that's because it's kind of the centre point of Gothic aesthetics and Gothic conventions. Although it's really important in 18th century Gothic, it's actually something that we still see today in contemporary Gothic, even if we're not fully aware of what it is or why it's there. But what actually is the Sublime? And we are talking capital T, capital S. You probably know what Sublime means. It's a term that, depending on how extravagant you are, you might use quite often. If something is sublime, it's brilliant, beautiful, outstanding. And that is kind of true for the sublime. The two meanings do overlap. But the sublime as a concept, and kind of as a theory, depending on how you look at it, means something slightly different. And hopefully I'm going to break that down for you. So what is the Sublime in the Gothic? That's probably the best place to start. I'll give you an example, and quite a famous one. In The Mysteries of Udolpho, Anne Radcliffe's most famous novel, published in 1798, there's a scene in which Emily St. Aubert, her step-uncle, pseudo-uncle, the villain of the novel, Montoni, has decided to move the family from France to Italy, and they're crossing the Alps, the mountains. Now, the men of the party, who are obsessed with military history, are having an argument about Hannibal and how Hannibal invaded Italy. As they're discussing troop movements and numbers and elephants, Emily, beholding the landscape of the mountains in front of her, begins to imagine that she can actually see and hear the soldiers. There's a very vivid scene in which Radcliffe, as narrator, describes what Emily can see. It's almost supernatural. It's not necessarily presented as imagination. Emily fancies that she can see it, but she can hear them moving, and it's so realistic that she can see sunlight glinting on their spears and their helmets. That is an example of the sublime in Gothic literature. How? Well, in this context, the sublime is greatness, it's power, it's almost divinity, something beyond mortal understanding. Okay, so I've given you an example of what the sublime looks like when you come across it in Gothic fiction. But that doesn't really explain what the sublime actually means, and how we define it, how we talk about it, and how on earth it ended up in our Gothic fiction. So where does the sublime come from? Most scholars would agree that it originates in a 1st century Greek text, whose name I will not attempt to announce because my ancient Greek is absolutely shocking, as is my contemporary Greek, to be honest. But it's translated into English in 1674. This is quite a crucial date because it's right at the start of the Age of Enlightenment, that period of scientific awakening and of philosophical, one day I will manage to say that correctly, of philosophical learning. The Age of Enlightenment was very interested in the revival of classical ideas and thinking, called neoclassicism, shockingly. The sublime then becomes a part of this, but it's not really solidified until 1757. That's when Edmund Burke, an MP and writer, publishes his Philosophical Enquiry into the Beautiful and Sublime. So in his inquiry, Burke made a distinction between the beautiful and the sublime. The beautiful, Burke said, was enchanting and alluring. He said that the beautiful was something that was pleasant and perhaps even healing. It was something that could soothe and calm the mind, but also the soul. To behold the beautiful was not just an aesthetically pleasing experience, but also a spiritual one, or even an emotional one. So the beautiful is something soft, something that one would turn to for comfort. The sublime, however, was something quite different. The sublime was compelling, but it was also awful, awesome, and terrifying. To experience the sublime was to see God in nature, essentially. It was divinity, supernatural power beyond mortal understanding. And whilst it was compelling, it was also potentially destructive. It was something that you could not tear your eyes away from, but that also shook your very core. Something that was terrible to behold, but also wonderful. And that's where we got that Gothic terror and wonder. In its simplest terms then, the sublime is greatness and power. And in the context of Gothic fiction, it is something beyond the mortal understanding. It is something that inspires awe. It's something terrible. It's something powerful. And that's why in Gothic fiction we often get it represented by nature, because nature cannot be man-made, and we get a real fascination with this in the 18th century. Now, not everybody agreed with Burke. In fact, a lot of people disagreed with him, and quite passionately so, chiefly the philosopher Kant, who took great issue with Burke's version of the sublime. But it was well talked about. So whether or not you agreed or disagreed with Burke, the sublime became a very popular concept and popular theory, and that's how it works its way into the heart of the Gothic. Because the Gothic is a literature of subversion. It's a literature of the self and understanding. And the sublime paves the way. It allows the Gothic to engage in that terror. And just a reminder, when we're talking about terror, it's something quite different to horror. It's something that expands the mind. Think of it as watching a plane crash or going on a roller coaster. You know that there is danger and destructiveness there, but you cannot help but pursue it or look at it. You can't tear your gaze away. That is the sublime in action. Sublime becomes the foundation of a number of Gothic aesthetics and conventions. In the 18th century, it is these moments of natural splendour and grandeur. The protagonist of the Gothic or romantic novel finds themselves looking upon a natural scene, be it a mountain, be it the Arctic, be it a storm, be it a shipwreck, and finds themselves questioning their very mortality. They become aware of the greatness and power in the world. Whether they believe in the monotheistic Christian God or not, it's this very humbling experience. So it's closely linked in that way to sensibility and sentimentality, which is why Radcliffe's heroines experience it quite often. So through that sublime, we get that creation of Gothic terror, and therefore we get that questioning. It expands the mind of the protagonist, and therefore expands the mind of the reader. So the sublime then is something bigger and bolder. It's something that really encompasses the struggle of humankind to understand their place in the world. Now, although in a lot of 18th century fiction it appears through nature and through natural circumstances, villains can also be sublime. In fact, Radcliffe's Montoni is often painted as a sublime figure. He is very handsome, he's smart, he's dashing, he is compelling, but he also is extremely destructive. And through him, Emily has a lot of realizations. So the sublime is something very tense in the Gothic, and it kind of treads that grey space between good and evil. So it's a really powerful thing for the Gothic to use. As we get into 19th century Gothic, and we have a lot more self-identification with the monstrous, we have a lot more experimentation with the subversive and the transgressive, the sublime can become something that is still used as an earth-shaking way to conventionalize, to remind the individual of their mortality and to put them back in their place. But it can also be something that allows an ascension, perhaps, a transformation. We even see it in contemporary Gothic. Think about rural American Gothic, when the protagonist looks out upon the vast landscape and realizes how small they are. You get it kind of in Lovecraft too. Cthulhu, the great tentacled beast that lives beneath the sea, is also an example of the sublime. He is an eldritch horror. He's extremely powerful, he lives beyond mortal understanding, and when you become aware of Cthulhu, you go insane because it is too much. So we still use the sublime to create terror. So TLDR, the sublime is greatness, power beyond mortal understanding. And that's essentially it in its simplest form. It's used in lots of different ways and it manifests in lots of different forms. But ultimately it comes down to that central conceit, that in nature, in the world, there are things beyond humans. And those things terrify but compel us. It's different to horror and it's different to beauty, but it's very powerful. And that is how you can talk about the sublime. I hope that all makes sense. If you have any further questions or you'd like to comment on what videos you'd like to see or terms you'd like explained in the future, remember to leave us a comment. You can find the rest of our videos on our channel and you can follow us over at Twitter at the Ghoul Guides. And in the meantime, stay safe and stay spooky.